I have the great pleasure of introducing our featured speaker today, Dr. Naomi Levine, who is assistant professor of English at Yale, where she works on 19th century poetry and poetics, aesthetics, and the history of criticism. She was previously a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows. Her first book, which I am so happy to have a copy of, right handy, um, The Burden of Rhyme, Victorian Poetry, Formalism, and the Feeling of Literary History, was published by the University of Chicago Press last fall. And her essays have appeared in Victorian Studies, Victorian Poetry, Victoriographies, Victorian Literature and Culture, a Modern Language Quarterly, and Literature Compass. So you have many opportunities to read her work. She's currently at work on a project I find fascinating sounding, Badness in Poetry, which begins from 20th century evaluative criticism and its reception of 19th century poems, but goes on to explore the entanglements of judgment and interpretation in the study of poetry more broadly. She also has a chapter about the way Victorian poetry sounded in the year 1929 and a forthcoming book on literature and sound studies, to which I know we will all look forward as well. Welcome today, Naomi, and please begin your talk, to which we're all looking forward.
Thank you so much. Let me just see if I can share my screen right away. Did that work? Okay, good. Okay. Okay, well, thank you so much to Linda and Val and the Tennyson Society. It's really an honor to be invited to talk here. So my talk it was advertised as Tennyson Stanza, but honestly, it should be called Tennyson's and Hallam's Stanza. So I have revised the title for the talk today. And this picture is the picture that's on the cover of my book, but I also want to point out something that is not on the cover of the book, which is the detail in the bottom right-hand corner, which is a weeping Dante near Paolo and Francesca. So the weeping Dante is not on the book cover, but is germane to this talk. Okay. So I wanted to start this talk by reflecting on the place of Tennyson in the book I just wrote and in my conception of poetry more generally. I think anyone who reads my book will recognize that in many ways, it's a book about the relationship between Alfred Tennyson and Arthur Hallam. It's about Hallam's love of rhyme and of literary history, and Tennyson's love of Hallam, and their shared experiment in poetic theorizing, and how after Hallam died, Tennyson missed him poetically, and how all those things redirected 19th century poetry toward an intensely historical and emotional view of poetic form. But that doesn't exhaust the significance of Tennyson for me. As I frame the book, it's about the way Victorians turned their questions about the effects of aesthetic forms into questions about the origins of aesthetic forms. In other words, the search for the origin of rhyme was part of a theoretical inquiry into the question, why does rhyme feel the way it does? The Victorian desire to answer that question with a historical story is also my desire. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the motivation of my research for the past many years has been a wish to answer for myself a question about Tennyson's forms and why they move me as they do. My way of answering that question, or dwelling with it, has been something like the Victorians' way, through obsessive historical research. For me, the best example of the feeling of rhyme is Tennyson's ABBA in memoriam stanza. That is the form that I never feel less acutely, no matter how many times I encounter it. Every time I read in memoriam is the first time. And every time I teach the in memoriam stanza, I'm both the teacher trying to explain it and the student struck to the heart by its mysterious emotional power. My intuition that there was something about the rhyme pattern, that actually Tennyson believed something mysterious about rhyme that let him do something mysterious with his rhyming was one of the impulses behind my book. Another impulse was to answer a more specific question, a question that at first appeared to be an answer to my first question about the feeling of Tennyson's stanza before it became a question of its own. That answer that was also a question was a line of Arthur Hallam's familiar to anyone who has studied Tennyson. Rhyme has been said to contain in itself a constant appeal to memory and hope. I first met this line in the work of Seamus Parry and Christopher Ricks, but it has circulated pretty widely in the field. I loved Hallam's idea. It seemed to articulate a profound truth about how we experience rhymes as we read them. And it seemed, as many others have noted, to offer a kind of key to the power of the in memoriam stanza, with its affecting interplay of near rhyme and distant rhyme. I also loved the way the word contain works. The suggestion that rhyme has an effect on the reader, it appeals to, it calls out to her longing for things past and things to come, because rhyme has intrinsic properties. That rhyme has something in it that appeals to memory and hope really intrigued me. So I liked that word contain, but I also was hung up on another part of the sentence, the has been said part. Where did Hallam get this idea of rhyme? Who had he been reading? So the question about the feeling of Tennyson's stanza form led to this question about the origin of Hallam's idea of rhyme, which led me eventually to the world of 19th century literary historiography. Hallam's sentence, for all its fame, is buried in a footnote of a little-known essay called The Influence of Italian Upon English Literature. In that essay, it's part of an argument about the transmission of rhyme from medieval Arabic to Provençal to Italian to English poetry. It's also part of an argument about the difference between the ancients and the moderns, or the classical and romantic phases of literature. Hallam suggests that rhyme is a modern invention because it accords with modern feelings. The ancients were insensible to its capacities because they felt differently. As I eventually discovered, Hallam's has been said is a reference to J.C.L. Simone de Sismondi's historical view of the literature of the south of Europe, published in 1813 and then in an English translation in 1823. It was an influential work of Romantic literary history that narrates the development of Mediterranean literature, beginning with chapters on Arabic and Provençal poetry. In his book, Sismondi theorizes rhyme's appeal to memory and hope via an anecdote about the Provençal troubadours learning rhyme from Arabic and Persian love poets, and using it to invent newly expressive stanzaic forms that would in turn teach future poets about the relationship between passionate feeling and prosody. So Hallam's sentence about the phenomenology of rhyme was also an idea about the origins of rhyme, and how the rhyme form condenses genesis and technique, or history and form, together. And I'll have more to say later about Sismondi's influence on Hallam and Tennyson. But to return to my own desire for a historical explanation for the feeling of Tennyson's in memoriam stanza. The historical explanation that I arrived at is this. Victorian poets had a different kind of knowledge than we do now about forms like rhyme. The knowledge that they had and that we've forgotten, and I'm using knowledge loosely to mean things known and things believed. The knowledge that they had was that rhyme was a form developed by medieval love poets to communicate feelings of melancholic desire and longing. Rhyme was a materialization of the troubadour concept of amour de loin, or distant love. It was a form that was passed from one literary culture to another as an expressive language, and it was a form that arrived in 19th century English poetry with an accumulated history of expressive uses. It carried its rich multicultural history of poetic feeling with it. And I should say that the project of my book wasn't to affirm or deny that story as historical fact, so much as consider what kinds of aesthetic possibilities stories like that enabled. Arthur Hallam's contribution to English poetry was to connect this historiography of rhyme to Tennyson's avant-garde poetics, and thereby to theorize Tennyson's work as a new kind of poetry engaged with historiographic ideas about form. Tennyson's contribution was to turn this kind of formalism into an eloquent language of his own, and to show other Victorian poets what poetic form, imagined in this way, could do. One piece of the book's argument is that we have lost contact with this view of form, which I call genetic formalism for its investment in origins. As a result of having lost contact with it, we've also lost contact with some of the aesthetic value of rhyme and of Victorian poetry. Essentially, we no longer know how to hold together the formal, historical, and affective aspects of poetry, or at least our repertoire of literary methods is pretty incompatible with this deeply integrated model. As professional literary criticism developed in the 20th century, it worked quite hard to disentangle form from both history and feeling. So the part of the book that bears on literary studies more broadly tells the story of literary method and the kind of dissociation of sensibility that took place, and its consequences for the way we read. The part that bears on Victorian poetry itself tries to read Victorian poems for this alien version of formalism that involved affective and historical thinking. So after discussing the 19th century theory of genetic formalism and its intellectual context of romantic literary historiography, and it's a generalist literary historiography that I'm interested in, one that covers multiple literary cultures. After doing that, the book looks at various manifestations of what I call historiographic form in the poetry of Tennyson, Barrett Browning, Morris, and Patmore. And I'm convinced that many other chapters could have been written on many other Victorian poets if there were world enough and time. Historiographic form means a few things in the book, but it mostly points to a use of form that is engaged with literary history as a story, a form that's in some sense theorizing and narrating the history of literature. And I argue that rhyme itself was a historiographic form insofar as it was understood to contain all of these stories about literary history, both stories about the spectacular invention of rhyme in medieval poetry and stories about rhyme's subsequent journey through European literary history. But there are other, perhaps easier to see versions of historiographic form in the book. As I demonstrate, larger poetic structures like the stanza, blank verse, and free verse were often used to reflect on the historical development of forms. My chapter on Alfred Tennyson is about his historiographic view of the stanza, and I'll be sharing a bit of that chapter today. But first, I'm going to speak briefly about some material that didn't make it into the final version of my book, but was formative for my own thinking about the problem of historiographic form. Okay, so this is part one, which is called A Lost Sonnet of Arnaud de Marveil. And it's part one of three parts. There are 3 parts left. As I suggested already, Hallam is a presiding theorist in my book. It's his theory of rhyme that guided me to my historical archive and to my sense of genetic formalism. It's his international conception of literary history that showed me how expansive the geographical and historical purview of Victorian poetry was. And it was his thought that explained Tennyson's poems to me. There was a moment, though, when I considered including Hallam as a poet, not just a theorist. I didn't do it. As my film editor mother used to say, that's on the cutting room floor. But I thought it might be interesting to look at a poem by Hallam that felt tantalizingly significant to me at the beginning of this project, and that I've continued to mull over. Here is the poem. Lady whose eyes are like the stars of heaven, out of pure dark, sending a glorious light. Lady whose cheek in dainty blushes bright vies with a roseate crown to angels given. Lady whose form more trances human sight than all who erst for beauty's palm have striven. Lady whose mind would charm the unforgiven and make them worship in a brief delight. I will not name thee, happy is thy lot, that though I speak the simple truth of thee, the curious world may read and know thee not. For now all foolish lovers' lays are such, that thy due praise is every woman's fee, else were it naming thee to say so much. The poem is a relatively conventional Italian sonnet with an octave, a volta, and a sestet. The poem is addressed to an unnamed lady, named as such 4 times, whose extraordinary beauty is celebrated and itemized in a blason-like sequence. Her eyes are like stars, her cheek like an angel's rosy halo, or is it a garland? Her figure has no match, her mind could convert a sinner. So far, so vague and cliched, but at the sestet, there's a witty subversion of the octave that feels almost anti-Petrarchan. Every foolish poet, the speaker says, pays hyperbolic tribute to his lady, with the same superlatives that I've used accurately to describe you. If that were not true, then my descriptions would immediately reveal your identity. By refusing to name his lady, the speaker allows her to blend in with all the other women less deserving of praise, but no less praised, who populate courtly love poetry. Hallam's sonnet has a fascinating archival history. I first encountered it as a sort of ghost document in the archives of the British Library. Over a decade ago, I was looking through an 1831 Hallam notebook, and I came to this page, which on the left-hand side has a note. The note says, the idea of this sonnet is taken from a canzone of and then crossed out, Arnold Marvey, the Provençal poet, Il men famoso Arnaldo of Petrarch. He lived in the 12th century. There's a note in the catalog, which I haven't been able to reconfirm because of the catalog being down, but I think my transcription is correct. It says F68V to 69. It is not clear whether the note on F68V, which is the left-hand side, relates to F69, a mere stub, and you can see that little stub in the middle, the torn out page, nor is it possible to, to F70, which is the page you actually can see on the right-hand side. Nor is it possible to identify the material on the stub with any certainty. So I didn't think the note about the troubadour poet had anything to do with the sonnet on the facing page, which is about Apollo and the Muses. But the tiny bit of writing that is still legible on that stub, and it's actually on the other side of the stub than the side you can see right now, held a clue. There was a capital I and a lowercase w, and that's just a picture of the stub. So if you can imagine what's in that shadowy part. There's a capital I and a space and a lowercase w. Which match up with the beginning of the line at the volta of the sonnet I just showed you, I will not name thee. So that seemed pretty clear. The sonnet of Hallam's, that sonnet of Hallam's appeared in a footnote, always a footnote with Hallam, of the 1832 essay he wrote to refute Professor Gabriele Rossetti's controversial reading of Dante's poetry as encoding an elaborate anti-papal conspiracy. And Gabriele, of course, was the father of D.G. and Christina Rossetti, and a Dante scholar. Hallam's objections to Rossetti's interpretation are many, but he seems most affronted by the suggestion that Dante's poetry is not actually about Christian love and romantic feeling, that the symbols and forms of medieval love poetry were nothing more than vehicles for smuggling illicit speech. In Hallam's paraphrase of Rossetti, when the foster fathers of the new language, which means vernacular Italian, rhymed after the fashion of their Provençal predecessors, who also, it turns out, were part of this conspiracy, they, quote, expounded their political theories in the deceitful form of sonnets and canzones. This idea is anathema to Hallam, who passionately believes in the organic relationship between the form of rhyme and the historical emergence of romantic feeling. And he believes very strongly in the expressive power of Dante's prosody. Throughout the review, or the essay, Hallam characterizes Rossetti as a paranoid fantasist with no feeling for poetry. In the footnote in question, he is also accusing him of knowing nothing about Provençal poems, which he says are, quote, the originals of all the subsequent love poetry, and in particular, of many things strange and some admirable in Dante and Petrarch. One thing I am noticing now that was less clear to me when I first read this essay is that Hallam is pitting his genetic argument about poetic form against Rossetti's more arbitrary sense of the relationship between form and content, and more overtly political sense of the relationship between form and history. But we're talking about Hallam's poem, which shows up in this footnote as evidence that Italian poetry evolved from Provençal poetry. Hallam writes, take, for example, the poem of Arnaud de Marvey, of which the following is an inadequate imitation. Of course, I was curious about Hallam's translation of this Provençal poem, given the centrality of troubadour poetry to his concept of literary history. But I couldn't find the original of this poem anywhere, not in the work of Sismondi or any of the other philological and historiographical studies that, in the first decades of the 19th century, enabled many readers to experience troubadour poetry for the first time. In the footnote, Hallam calls it an inadequate imitation. What does that mean? There's a charming moment in an exchange of letters between Charles Lyell and Gabriele Rossetti, where Lyell takes a break from critiquing Hallam's essay point by point to remark, this is one of the prettiest sonnets in English I ever read. Have you the original by Arnaud de Marvey or an Italian translation? And I should say that Rossetti, I think, replies that he does know where the original is and that it's in a book by Renouard. But I'll come to that in a moment. I think he was bluffing. I think he was bluffing a little. Okay. T.H. Vale Motor, the editor of the amazing writings of Arthur Hallam, also wondered about the sonnet's provenance. It appears at the end of his edited collection with a pretty discouraged sounding note. Unfortunately, the poem does not appear to translate anything discoverably by Arnaud de Marveil, nor by his contemporaries Arnaud Daniel, Sordel, or Giraud Riquier, whose work Hallam knew. Hallam has made a sonnet of a troubadour song of de Marveil's time and style, now impossible to identify. This is more or less what Hallam says in the British Library note. He says the idea of this sonnet is taken from a canzone by Arnaud de Marveil. Motor's indefatigable efforts to identify the medieval original are vividly documented in his papers, which are at the Princeton archives. And here I want to thank a Princeton archivist who gave me a tour of documents that I wanted to see over Zoom during the pandemic and actually sent me pictures of them. So it was an archival trip that was entirely virtual. So here you can see the diligent work, the diligent research process by which Motor arrived at the conclusion that there is, in fact, no original poem. So there's these pages and then these pages. There's a list of literary histories of the troubadours that he's checking. There's a list of other troubadour poets he's eliminating as possibilities. You can see that on the right-hand side there, Arnaud Daniel, Riquier, Sordel. He's going through the list there, the ones I just read to you. There's a list of variant names for Arnaud de Marveil. That's on the left-hand side, upper right-hand corner. So sometimes he's Arnaldo, sometimes he's Mareuil. And biographical information and details about his reception. There's a note about a poem erroneously attributed to Arnaud, and in the middle of one of the pages, the note, no sonnets. This is a key point, and one that brings me around to the idea of historiographic form. Hallam knew that sonnets had not yet been invented by the 12th century and were a later Italianization of earlier Provençal forms. Sismondi reports the existence of, quote, some sonnets in the Provençal language, but, quote, they are posterior to the earliest Italian sonnets and even to those of Petrarch. This chronology is corroborated by current scholarship, which suggests that the sonnet likely developed out of forms like the canzone or canso, and that the earliest known true sonnets appeared in the first decades of the 13th century after the death of Arnaud de Marveil. And that's the Princeton Encyclopedia of Poetry and Poetics. Sorry, my cold is catching up with me a little bit. So why does Hallam choose to write an inadequate imitation of an Arnaud poem in a form that didn't yet exist? This isn't a mistranslation, and it's not an anachronistic mistake. It's something else, a demonstration of a literary historiographic idea in the form of a poem. Hallam is committed to the idea that the Italian sonnet originated in the Provençal canzone, or canzone is how you would say it in Italian. Here he's interested in the way the stylized muse of Italian poetry emerges from the donna innominata, unnamed lady figure of troubadour poetry. And Christina Rossetti, of course, makes a similar case in her headnote to Monna Innominata. But more importantly, Hallam is interested in how the sonnet form as a prosodic structure comes from the canzone form, which actually looks quite different from the sonnet. Here's an Arnaud de Marveil poem that shows you his canzone form and also suggests elements of Hallam's poem. Excuse me. And this is from François Renouard's 1816 study of the troubadours, which came out after the first French version of Sismondi, but before the English translation. So you can see that instead of a one stanza sonnet, it's organized as a sequence of unrhymed stanzas that all rhyme with each other line by line. So the A's and the B's, etc. And most of the stanzas begin with domna, lady. If Hallam adapted this poem, a salut d'amour or domnagère, he compacted this sequence of domnas into the anaphoras of the octave that you saw in the sonnet. So stanza is reduced to line, like a syrup is reduced in cooking. And in the penultimate stanza, there's a suggestion like Hallam's, which you might be able to discern if you have a bit of French. There's a suggestion like Hallam's about the way other troubadours exaggerate the beauty of their mistresses. Perhaps he turned this turn into a sonnet volta. So that's a possibility. But Hallam is not just hybridizing two forms, a Petrarchan sonnet and a Provençal canzone. He's showing how one form might have morphed into another, or looked at from the other direction, how one form might bear the traces of its historical development. And more recently, I've wondered if a poem like Tennyson's Now Sleeps the Crimson Petal could be understood similarly, as not a hybrid of the Italian sonnet and the Persian ghazal, which I think it often is considered to be, but as a poem that is thinking prosodically about the genetic relationship between the sonnet and the ghazal, the form that Hallam considered an earlier source of the Provençal and Italian love lyrics. Understood thus, the question of Tennyson's familiarity with the Persian language is less germane than the fact of his familiarity with literary historiography. So that's one way that we can understand Hallam's poem as a historiographic form. It's telling a story in technique about the love poetry tradition. But it's a historiographic form in a more literal way too. It's a poem inspired by and in conversation with the works of European literary historiography that Hallam was reading. Those books which translated and paraphrased and prosified and reversified and retranslated historical poetic forms into English, French, Italian, etc., were his archive, both teaching him historical poetry and teaching him how to make poetry out of literary history. And I want to show you one other example of a poem that also looks like the Hallam poem, and it looks more like a sonnet. It's not a sonnet, it's shorter than a sonnet, but the second half of it has that claim about other troubadours' exaggerations. And if you trace this poem back through sort of a sequence of literary histories, you'll see that this English translator of Sismondi, Thomas Roscoe, has taken two paragraphs that were prose paragraphs and turned them into one poem, but they actually belong to two different poems. So that's sort of like an especially kind of stylized version of it. And you can see him talking about his translation at the bottom there. And just to press on this point, I want to show you something kind of wonderful on Motor's copy of Hallam's sonnet, which seems to be an early draft of the sonnet from an Oxford library, although I haven't seen this Hallam page firsthand. Above the sonnet itself are two things. And I should say that here we have both Hallam's hand and Motor's hand, and you can see Motor's trying to transcribe and sort of understand some of Hallam's writing. Okay, so above the sonnet itself are two things. On the upper right-hand side is a list of rhyme words that shows us one part of Hallam's creative process. On the upper left is a set of words that I now know how to read better than I once did. They say Teutonic, Roman, Oriental, and then in the middle, Romance, and then underneath, Arabic, Ok. There you go. Arabic, Ok, as in Languedoc, and Oile, Northern. And the latter are references to the medieval Romance vernaculars of Provence and northern France. This is Hallam's history of rhyme and romantic literature in a minimalist diagram. It's the story he tells in his essay on Italian literature about the convergence of influences that produce Southern European poetry and its rhyming. What I love about this juxtaposition is that it presents rhyme's form and rhyme's history together. And together these constitute the matrix of Hallam's sonnet draft. It's a picture of Hallam's creative process that makes utterly clear the aesthetic and also the intellectual elements that allowed him to compose his Arnaud de Marveil poem. So having looked at Hallam's quite literal version of a historiographic stanza, I'm going to turn now to a bit of my Tennyson chapter to demonstrate what historiographic form looks like in his work. The chapter begins by rereading the feeling of the In Memoriam stanza in light of the origin of rhyme theories that I outlined quite extensively in the previous chapter. And I'm trying to show with that reading how a reading experience that we recognize as aesthetic could be an unrecognized encounter with literary historical ideas. So after that In Memoriam reading, the chapter considers Tennyson's career-long interest in the expressive potentials of stanzaic form. but the bulk of the chapter is about poems chiefly lyrical, Tennyson's first book. I'll be focusing here on the last part of the chapter, which shows how Hallam's famous review of Tennyson's book draws on Sismondi's literary historical categories, and how Tennyson implements those ideas as prosody in an early poem, The Ballad of Oriana. And I'm going to try to pronounce Oriana properly instead of Canadianly. I always want to call it Oriana. Okay, so part 2. Hallam's review of poems chiefly lyrical, on some characteristics of modern poetry, and on the lyrical poems of Alfred Tennyson from 1831 is best known for framing Tennyson as a poet of sensation in the vein of Keats and Shelley, rather than a Wordsworthian poet of reflection. The poet of sensation, according to Hallam, is an exceptional person, more alive to sensory experiences than his fellow men, and more able to translate those experiences into poetry than the majority of even his fellow poets. Tennyson, says Hallam, shares the sensitivity of Shelley and Keats, but in him, quote, the features of original genius are clearly and strongly marked. We recognize the spirit of his age, but not the individual form of this or that writer. His thoughts bear no more resemblance to Byron or Scott, Shelley or Coleridge than to Homer or Calderon or Firdusi or Kalidasa. In this strikingly international list of non-resemblances, Hallam is making a perverse sort of claim. Tennyson is unlike everyone else, just like those giants of world literature whom he in no way resembles. Throughout the review, Hallam treads this fine line between identifying Tennyson with his best precursors, whether in English or in Greek, Spanish, Persian, or Sanskrit, and always distinguishing him from them. This is the central paradox of the poet of sensation. He is both generic and completely new. Hallam likely found in Sismondi's work many of his central concepts ready-made. The opening pages of Historical View of the Literature of the South of Europe, which present the unifying thesis of Sismondi's study, seem to have provided Hallam with the terms that he used to approach Tennyson's poems. In Sismondi, Hallam would have encountered the poet of sensation and the poet of reflection. In Sismondi, he would have found the diagnosis of modern melancholy and what he calls the return of the mind upon itself, with its turning away from, quote, community of interest. What is remarkable about Hallam's essay is less the invention or adoption of such terms than their canny repurposing. In Sismondi's books, sensation and reflection are historical categories, with periods of spontaneous feeling yielding to periods of reflection in the development of literary cultures. Sismondi's French terms are sentiment and réflexion. Thomas Roscoe's English translations are feeling and reflection. It is not so much that sensation belongs to one particular historical epoch versus another, ancient versus modern, for example, but that sensation and reflection are two successive periods within a particular national literary history. The early Greeks and the troubadours both shared the sensitive and creative energy that Hallam assigns to Tennyson. Quote, feeling with them takes the lead of judgment and may conduct them to the highest results, Sismondi writes. Quote, such was Greece in her infancy, such perhaps were the European nations in their first development during the Middle Ages, and such are all nations by which by their native energy rise out of barbarism and which have not suffered the spirit of imitation to extinguish their natural vigor. Concrete examples strengthen the polemical force of this distinction by incorporating a wide range of primary materials, specimens of Arabic, Persian, Provençal, Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese poems. Sismondi can make his historicist case for revaluing the verse forms and styles of early Romance poetry, which French neoclassical taste had devalued. One might think that Sismondi's examples would be useful models for the working poet. They gather all into one place and to an unprecedented degree so much stanzaic variety. And framing all of these forms are discussions of the prosodic systems that govern the poetry in each language, sometimes with scansion marks. But Sismondi's introduction makes clear the difference between masterpieces and models. He argues that poets at the origins of literary cultures do not rely on models. They invent the systems that they use. When a culture first begins to express itself in its own literary language, when it has not yet begun to reach for the rules derived from other cultures and other languages, its poets are prosodic innovators. However, Sismondi cautions, the spirit of imitation inevitably creeps in. Reflection, he says, soon succeeds to this vehement effervescence. The mind feeds upon its own enthusiastic feelings, which withdraw themselves from the observations of others. And the energy of the mind is seen to react continually upon itself. Sismondi offers several instances of this decline. The Romans eventually copied the Greeks, the Arabs began to worship Aristotle, the Italians in the 16th century and the French in the 17th century began to imitate the ancients, and then the Germans, Polish, and Russians began to imitate the French. For Sismondi, the reflective turn tells in prosody. Reflective poets, quote, encumber themselves with the fetters of a refined versification and resort mechanically, quote, to the return of rhymes which restrict their thoughts. So rather than presenting his poetic extracts as models to be copied, they often stand as poignant reminders of what was possible before European literatures became reflective. As a result, the chapters that treat the origins of modern lyric poetry emphasize the ideal of formal innovation, using their extracts and descriptions to demonstrate what poetic forms can look and feel like when they are not being imitative. The two poetic cultures that developed rhyme, medieval Arabic and Provençal, both wrote poetry that was, quote, entirely lyric. Both poetries were characterized by deep feeling, especially, quote, the passion of love. Both cultures highly valued the production of new forms of poetic expression. Arabic and Persian poets, rejecting the, quote, cold poetry of the Greeks, invented bold metaphors, extravagant allegories, and excessive hyperboles. On the authority of the Orientalist William Jones, Sismondi points to the same spirit of artful extravagance, that's his word, in Arabic and Persian versification, which apparently married formal constraint with prosodic pyrotechnics, as when, quote, the same rhyme, or rather the same terminating vowel, is repeated in every other line for several pages, or when the poet, quote, regularly pursues in his rhymes all the letters of the alphabet. In Provençal poetry, Sismondi found the troubadours expanding the affective range of this prosodic system, varying their rhymes in 1,000 different ways, that's a Sismondi quote, to express the varied and ineffable, quote, emotions of the soul. Though the troubadours adopted the subtle mechanism of rhyme from the Arabians, they are nonetheless, quote, the inventors of our poetical measures because they developed the European rhymed stanza with its infinite variability. Medieval Arabic and Provençal poetry both appear as examples on the world historical scale of what Hallam will term sensation poetics. Characteristics is a work of criticism that metabolizes literary historiography, turning Sismondi's historical theories into a way of reading and writing contemporary poetry. It makes of Sismondi's historicism a kind of formalism, though that risks being a clumsy characterization of both writers' work, which always seems to move smoothly between the macro and the micro, the world historical scene and the prosodic detail on the page. In Arthur Hallam's review, Sismondi's historical categories are dehistoricized to the extent that poets of sensation and poets of reflection can coexist in the same culture and moment, as Keats and Wordsworth do. Yet Hallam's account of sensation and reflection isn't without historical resonance. Echoes of Sismondi's argument can be heard throughout the review, as when Hallam remarks that, quote, the age in which we live comes late in our national progress. That first raciness and juvenile vigor of literature is gone, never to return. Since that day, we have undergone a period of degradation. And elsewhere, quote, this is also Hallam, hence the melancholy which so evidently characterizes the spirit of modern poetry, hence that return of the mind upon itself. The framework then of Sismondi's historiography provides a context for representing Tennyson as almost impossibly gifted, as a genius out of time. When Hallam finally comes to the criticism of Tennyson's poems, Sismondi is everywhere. Like Sismondi's vigorous poets, Tennyson, quote, imitates nobody. Many of the, quote, distinctive excellencies of Tennyson's style are in fact values associated with Sismondi's medieval lyric poets. Not just the exquisite modulation of meters, but also, quote, his luxuriance of imagination, and at the same time, his control over it. Indeed, the poems that Hallam chooses to close read are striking experiments in stanzaic and figurative imagining. The two that he treats first and at the greatest length are Recollections of the Arabian Nights and the Ballad of Oriana. two poems that, as Hallam frames them, borrow the formal methods of medieval Romantic poetry. They evoke historical sensation poetics without copying, indeed by not copying, any particular historical form. And they also show two poles of Tennyson's stanza practice, extremes of prosodic variety and prosodic redundancy. And I'm not going to be talking about Arabian Nights today, just Oriana. In Hallam's Sismondian reading of Tennyson, literary history appears less as a collection of discrete sources and models than as one continuous story about the origins of literary forms. His historiographic literary criticism doesn't account for every feature of poems chiefly lyrical, but it does help us see the historical aspect of Tennyson's early formalism, and especially how his stanzas can cite ideas about literary history without reproducing specific literary historical precedents, like the ghazal or the rubai or some familiar version of the ballad stanza. Neither poem uses a recognizable historical verse form, and partly because of this, their stanzas can be viewed as historiographic forms. These poems interest me because their formal engagement with literary history is both very concrete and very abstract. Tennyson uses rhyme patterns and stanzaic shapes and sounds to think, with Hallam, about originality as a historical phenomenon, about a tradition of poetic newness that reaches back into the distant past. And now I come to the third and last part, the Ballad of Oriana. In the Ballad of Oriana, Hallam finds the poetic technique of Italian lyric operative in ballad form. And this prompts him to elaborate the affective component of genetic formalism, the idea that old forms carry the old feelings they were invented to express. The focus of Hallam's analysis is specifically the feeling of Tuscan poetics, but like the stanza of Arabian Nights, the stanza of the Ballad of Oriana also tells a larger romantic story about stanzaic form. Hallam reads the Ballad of Oriana as an exemplary use of literary history. The title of the poem indicates that Tennyson is working with the ballad tradition, but Hallam maintains that this ballad is different from other modern ballads in its careful negotiation of the relationship between new and old. Tennyson's achievement, according to Hallam, lies in his ability to differentiate between an imitative use of literary conventions and a creative application of literary historical lessons. Here's a famous passage. The author is well aware that the art of one generation cannot become that of another by any will or skill, but the artist may transfer the spirit of the past, making it a temporary form for his own spirit, and so effect, by idealizing power, a new and legitimate combination. If we were asked to name among the real antiques that which bears the greatest resemblance to this gem, we should refer to the ballad of Fair Helen of Kirkconnell in the minstrelsy of the Scottish border. It is a resemblance of mood, not of execution. They are both highly wrought lyrical expressions of pathos, and it is very remarkable with what intuitive art every expression and cadence in Fair Helen is accorded to the main feeling. Instead of naming the concrete narrative or generic materials that Tennyson borrows from the ballad tradition, and they are many, the trope of tragic love, for instance, or the form of the refrain, Hallam emphasizes the spirit of the old ballads that Tennyson has managed to distill into a new form that partakes of both the past and the present. As a poet of sensation, it is important that Tennyson's procedure owes as much to his poetic feeling as it does to his poetic skill. The Ballad of Oriana is highly wrought in two different but involved ways. It is a masterfully executed artwork, and it is also an expression of passionate emotion. Through the same intuitive art that governs the Fair Helen ballad, Tennyson creates an original poem that operates in the same way that Fair Helen does, by establishing a correspondence between the poem's formal and affective registers. But Hallam insists that Tennyson's ballad goes further even than Fair Helen does in this kind of correspondence, and that it derives inspiration from a deeper literary source than Scottish balladry, the lyric poetry of medieval Italy. He says that lyric poetry is in fact defined by an idea of expressive form. The characters that distinguish the language of our lyrical from that of our epic ballads have never yet been examined with the accuracy they deserve, but beyond question, the class of poems which in point of harmonious combination Oriana most resembles is the Italian. Just thus, the meditative tenderness of Dante and Petrarch is embodied in the clear, searching notes of Tuscan song. These mighty masters produce 2/3 of their effect by sound. Not that they sacrifice sense to sound, but that sound conveys their meaning where words would not. Whereas Fair Helen uses every expression and cadence to shore up its atmospheric effects, Tuscan poetry works with smaller prosodic units, notes and tones. It uses, quote, a harmonious combination of individual sounds, and these combined sounds are expressive in ways that phrases, words, and larger rhythmic patterns are not. Echoing Sismondi's description of troubadour rhyme, Hallam remarks that, quote, there are innumerable shades of fine emotion in the human heart, which are too subtle and too rapid to admit of corresponding phrases, yet they exist, and in music they find a medium through which they pass from heart to heart. The tone becomes the sign of the feeling, and they reciprocally suggest each other. This is the musical and emotional language of form that Sismondi traced to the troubadour lyric stanza. Hallam does not name outright the poetic effect that he's describing as assonance or rhyme. He stays at the level of abstraction and more or less sustains the conceit of music. But if we follow his argument about the differences between the Ballad of Oriana and Fair Helen further than he does, we can see how vowel tones and their rhymes might accumulate into feelings. The clearest connection between the two poems is the story, which turns on a tragic accident that leaves the heroine dead. In Fair Helen, Helen intercepts a shot meant for her lover and fired by his rival, and the lover's consequent retaliation is gruesome. I hacked him in pieces sma, he tells us. In the Ballad of Oriana, the pathos is pitched higher still as Oriana is shot by the lover himself when his target steps aside and leaves her in his arrow's path. This is a crucial revision since it means that the lover is doubly burdened with the loss of his beloved, as well as with the unbearable knowledge that he is himself responsible for her death. When he exclaims, "O cursed hand, O cursed blow, Oriana," it is a cry of self-reproach for a starkly unredeemable loss. When Helen's lover utters almost the same words, the effect is quite different. His affirmation of vengeance also pays tribute to a sacrifice that is not without its martyrly beauty. And this is the top quotation. Cursed be the heart that thought the thought, and cursed the hand that fired the shot, when in my arms bird Helen dropped and died to succor me. Just as Tennyson borrows the tragic outline of the ballad's narrative only to magnify its tragic possibilities, he approaches the ballad's form in the spirit of hyperbole. Scott's Fair Helen stanza is made up of a mono-rhyme triplet and a fourth line whose rhyme remains consistent throughout the poem. In the ballad's first stanza, the narrative quality of this fourth line refrain is immediately apparent, and that's the bottom one. I wish I were where Helen lies, night and day on me she cries, oh, that I were where Helen lies on fair Kirkconnell Lea. In 5 of the 10 stanzas, the fourth line acts as a refrain, establishing and circling back to the one central location of all the narrative's key events. Helen's death, the murder of her murderer, the place of her burial and grave, the place where the lover wishes to be buried in turn, on fair Kirkconnell Lea. In the remaining 5 stanzas, however, the fourth line only rhymes with this refrain, most frequently on the word me, and doesn't restate it. Tennyson references these elements of rhyme and refrain, but presses them to extraordinary new lengths. Instead of using a rhyming triplet and a final refrain, his poem stanza mono-rhymes 5 times and obsessively rings its refrain, simply the word Oriana, a remarkable 4 times between almost every narrative line. In the first stanza of Tennyson's poem, the affective consequences of this sonic thickening are impossible to miss. My heart is wasted with my woe, Oriana. There is no rest for me below, Oriana. When the long down wolds are ribbed with snow, and loud the Norland whirlwinds blow, Oriana. Alone I wander to and fro, Oriana. Tennyson's first line sounds a lot like the ballad's first line. It has the same tone of desolation, the same iambic tetrameter rhythm, and it begins accumulating a similar sequence of W sounds. Compare, my heart is wasted with my woe, to I wish I were where Helen lies. But very quickly a pattern of open-mouthed vowels, here long O's, emerges as dominant. Woe, Oriana, no, below, Oriana, snow, Oriana, Norland, blow, alone, fro, Oriana. The pain that the poem describes becomes an audible, almost a visible howl. The most notable difference between Tennyson's prosody and the ballad that inspired him then is the density of vowel sounds and the consequent intensification of the affective element. In Hallam's terms, the Italianization of the ballad material. So where the speaker of Fair Helen simply describes the experience of being haunted by the lost woman. Night and day on me she cries, out of my bed she bids me rise, says haste and come to me. The ballad of Oriana makes haunting an effect of form. The lover's subjective experience is not, as it is in Fair Helen, hygienically sealed in the poem's diegesis. It has seeped outward to the shape and sound of the poem. The persistent refrain, Oriana, performs the lover's stymied efforts at coming to terms with his loss in a series of increasingly urgent vocatives. Oh, breaking heart that will not break, Oriana, oh, pale, pale face so sweet and meek, Oriana, thou smilest, but thou dost not speak, and then the tears run down my cheek, Oriana, what wantest thou, whom dost thou seek, Oriana? This refrain, the burden, invokes ballad conventions, but also in its excesses defamiliarizes them. For Hallam, the excessiveness is the point. After entertaining the idea that the name occurs once too often in every stanza, he concludes that, quote, the proportion of the melodious cadences to the pathetic parts of the narration could not be diminished without materially affecting the rich lyrical impression of the ballad. And it is true that Oriana behaves strangely for a refrain. Unlike the phrase on fair Kirkconnell Lee, the repetition of the name here does almost no contextualizing work. Once Tennyson has established that Oriana is the sole object of the lover's thoughts, the word can only be an index of the lover's unrelenting grief, his singularly heavy burden. Rhetorically, it is pure apostrophe, the Petrarchan lyric address as ballad refrain. Sonically, it is as close to pure assonance as a multisyllabic word can come, the Petrarchan feminine rhyme on overdrive. And in the repetition of the heroine's name, the stanza offers a formal analog for the fatal intercession of Oriana's body atween the lover and the arrow meant for him. By reducing the ballad refrain to just one word, and by expanding the field of action of that one word to the entire stanza, Tennyson blurs the distinction between refrain and rhyme. If refrain creates continuity across stanzas, Oriana is a refrain because all the stanzas share the recurrence of that word. But the sequence of Orianas also constitutes an internal structure within each stanza, one that plays against its system of monorhymes to become something both less and more than monorhyme, a scheme of identical rhymes. Identical rhyme is less of a rhyme than monorhyme because it doesn't fulfill what we think of as the basic requirement of rhyme, the combination of repetition and difference that is apparent in the shift from, say, cheek to seek. But for the same reason, identical rhyme is a stronger and more perfect rhyme than monorhyme, achieving the objectives of monorhyme more completely than monorhyme can. The feeling of melancholic inertia that the monorhymes already produce in the Ballad of Oriana is exacerbated by a contrapuntal rhyme scheme that won't evolve with each new iteration in its sequence. Here, rhyme's appeal to memory becomes traumatic. In Hallam's Sismondian terms, the poem suffers from too much memory and too little hope. Tennyson has isolated the most expressive elements of the medieval Tuscan stanza, and he has made them the primary material of his poem. In doing so, he calls attention to the quiet persistence of Romance language poetics and its techniques, its effects in all modern European stanzaic forms. But Tennyson is also reminding us of the debt European poetry owes to Arabic poetics. If the Arabian Nights stanza suggested a historiographically focalized view of stanzaic form, Arabic literature seen retrospectively through the scrim of Provençal rhyme, the effect in the Ballad of Oriana is more layered and more auditory. An English ballad heard in the key of a Tuscan sonnet, heard in the key of an Arabic ghazal. The ballad's monorhymes and refrain, in addition to citing the unusually monorhymed ballad stanza of Fair Helen, and in addition to multiplying the expressive Italianate vowels, recall the rhyme and refrain pattern of the Arabic and Persian ghazal as Sismondi describes it. Sismondi had used that rhyme and refrain pattern to prove the genetic relationship between Provençal and Arabic lyric. Tennyson adapts it into English by way of Italian, restoring the history of the English and Scottish ballad to a longer and more international history of rhyme. It's easy to see why Hallam chooses the Ballad of Oriana as a case study for Tennyson's poetic method in poems chiefly lyrical. It beautifully condenses his history of rhyme. But more importantly, it exemplifies his theory of sensation poetry. Tennyson's form is not imitative. It seems to be brand new, and like the Arabian Nights stanza and the In Memoriam stanza and the Tears, Idle Tears stanza, developed precisely for its occasion. One could hardly imagine the same stanza being so appropriate to any other poem, or imagine the same poem with a different stanza. And Hallam insists that this particular fit of form to effective content, or tone to feeling, makes the poem lyrical. That is, the extravagant quantity of sad and sonorous Orianas produces, quote, the rich lyrical impression of the ballad. Hallam's definition of lyrical thus involves a form that is full of feeling, but the feeling in the Ballad of Oriana is of a special kind. It isn't exactly Tennyson's feeling, or if it is Tennyson's feeling and for effective form, rather than an expression of his own subjective experience. This idea of lyric is romantic and expressive, but not in the ways that are usually meant when the romantic lyric is invoked. It is romantic in a historiographic sense. It derives from ideas like those of Sismondi about what modern poetic forms were invented to do when romantic literatures were first coming into being. And it is expressive insofar as it reaches for an always subtler and more perfect correspondence between the poem's feeling and its form. Tennyson continued to develop and refine the romantic lyric stanza long after Hallam's death. In fact, Hallam's death prompted some of his most sophisticated efforts in that direction. The depersonalized, formalized feeling of Oriana goes some way toward clarifying the lyrical quality of more autobiographical poems like Tears, Idle Tears, and In Memoriam, without recourse to expressivist theory. If romantic feeling is already in the forms of rhyme and assonance and already an ideal of the lyric stanza, then the poet's task is to cultivate those emotive possibilities, to meticulously arrange the prosodic components in such a way that lets them speak the historical feelings they carry. The stanza form of In Memoriam, as I suggested earlier, seems conscious of itself as a structure of desire and grief. It seems to speak about, as much as through, the amour de loin and memory and hope of rhyme. The stanza form of Tears, Idle Tears accomplishes an even more impressive feat. It evokes rhyme's romantic longing at the same time as it makes rhyme itself a lost object of desire. Through its assonances, its almost rhymes, and its missed rhymes, the Tears, Idle Tears stanza yearns hopelessly and hopefully toward the condition of rhyme. T.S. Eliot heard these sounds in Tears, Idle Tears, and he intuitively felt them to be the location of the poem's feelings. But he didn't register the historiographic theories of rhyme and lyric motivating Tennyson's stanza craft. Eliot said that Tennyson was, quote, the great master of metric as well as of melancholia. What he didn't say is that for Tennyson, the melancholy was part of the prosody, and it had been since the origin of rhyme. Thank you.